Thank you to those of you who are showing up on time. We'll pause for a moment to see who else wants to join us in the space. It's good to see some familiar faces and some new ones. Okay, great. Welcome one and all. My name is Javon Dang Lee. I'm the Transpersonal Coaching Psychology course leader at Aleph Trust, and I'll be hosting this evening's session with Terence Sexton, and he'll be taking us on an exploration of how consciousness development is a necessary part of the journey in implementing the inner development goals. So I'll start by reading Terry's biography, and then I'll hand over to him to take us on the journey. Terence has over 25 years of experience working as a leadership psychologist and has a keen interest in exploring the developing consciousness. His work mainly involves executive profiling, executive coaching, and leadership development. And in recent years, his focus has been on sustainable leadership, enabling leaders to co-create a better future for us all. Terence has written and published a book called Consciousness Beyond Consumerism, a psychological path to sustainability. Writing this book spurred him to study for a PhD in applied transpersonal psychology with the Aleph Trust. Terence's research is a cooperative inquiry into how changemakers can develop their consciousness so they gain the greater capability to work with complexity of the meta-crisis that we're now facing. He will be drawing on his research and sharing the key findings throughout this webinar. So Terence, thank you so much for coming to share your knowledge and experience with us. Good to have you here. I'm handing over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Javon. Thank you for that introduction. Very much appreciated. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session. Lovely to see you. Lovely to see you all. I'll just share my slides. Okay. There we go. Can you see them? Yeah, looking good. Okay, great. Okay, so we're all here today to explore consciousness development in relationship to the inner development goals, the IDGs. So why are we here? Why have we all come together to explore consciousness development in the IDGs? Why are we giving our time to this? What's brought us all together today? And I think it's because of this. The poly crisis. We're facing today, as we know, a multitude of crises, be they environmental, social, psychological. And those crises have spurred perhaps other crises around economics and politics and technology. And all of these crises are interdependent, they interact, they reinforce each other. So much so that some people are describing the crises that we're facing as a meta-crisis. And what that means is it's a unified whole that we're facing, one big crisis that has emergent properties. And I think this is a good representation of the crisis because it shows the interconnection produced by the World Economic Forum here. So what are we doing about this crisis that we're facing as a society? Well, our solutions, or the United Nations solutions, are the Sustainable Development Goals, which I think were launched around 2015. And looking at the latest report, Progress Report 2024, we are severely off track. We are not achieving these goals. And I think we're to achieve them by 2030. We're severely off track. We're not making sufficient progress. So why is that? And of course, there may be many, many reasons why we're not making sufficient progress towards the sustainability goals. But one that's come out quite strongly is that in trying to create a more sustainable society, we've been focusing on outer change. We've looked at technological changes, policy changes, strategy changes, etc., etc. And in doing that, we've missed that inner world. And some scholars are arguing that actually, if we want to create change in society, there's more leverage with working with that inner world, changing that inner world, that inner development, if you like. And that's what I want to explore with you today, is how do we work with that inner development so that it creates outer change, a change in society. So society is going to transform. And if we are to achieve these sustainable development goals, society needs to transform to achieve them, especially with climate change. But it's often said that if society doesn't transform, if we don't tackle climate change, then society will be transformed. So we're looking at a transformation of society, whatever happens. It's climate change will transform our society, or we need to transform our society to tackle climate change. Either way, society is going to be transformed. It's just really our choice of which way it goes, how it happens. Now, within our society, it's the corporations that have the big influence that can create the change in our society. And many of these big corporations want to be part of the solution to sustainability crisis that we're facing, and have signed up to working towards achieving some of these sustainable development goals, the ones that are relevant to their industry. But these organisations now, the corporations, are also finding that they have to deal with an increasingly complex operating environment, the environment within which they operate. And that's often being described now as VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. So not only are these organisations having to work with a VUCA operating environment, they're also having to contribute and be part of the solution to our sustainability problems. And as we saw from that first slide from the World Economic Forum, our sustainability problems are enormously complex. So organisations are having to work with a high level of complexity, a high level of volatility, a high level of change. But are they set up to work with high levels of VUCA? Because the template for our organisations, for our corporations, comes from the Industrial Revolution. Companies were then set up as investment vehicles to attract investment, to invest into machinery, into factories. So they were primarily a vehicle to attract the investment. And then, of course, their purpose is to provide a return on that investment for the shareholders. So primarily a financial vehicle to finance the Industrial Revolution. And at the time, we fell in love with machines because that was the new wonder technology. So we designed our corporations, our organisations, to behave like machines. So we can see that today, that in a corporation, work is divided into small chunks, division of labour. The organisation is divided into separate units, teams, divisions, business units. We have in place a number of controls, processes and procedures to control the organisation, to keep it stable, to try and make it become more efficient as it can. Now, that's what we've inherited from the Industrial Revolution, is the machine-like organisation. And these organisations are very successful in stable operating environments, but they become overwhelmed when faced with VUCA because they can't respond quickly enough. They're not agile enough. So perhaps we need a new metaphor in which to design our organisations. And one that's coming through is the metaphor of the ecosystem. Could our organisations be designed and behave like ecosystems, and what would that look like? And in an ecosystem, there's no separation. Everything is connected and interconnected. Everything flows together. There's no overall control process. Everything emerges naturally. So things emerge and then fall back and die naturally. And perhaps in an ecosystem organisation, rather than the hierarchy we have in a machine organisation, perhaps leadership is distributed and emergent. Anybody can lead. And people take leadership when the time is right for the situation, for them, and how they can contribute. So perhaps an ecosystem type organisation may enable our corporations to work better in terms of delivering the sustainable development goals, but also in terms of responding to the VUCA world they find themselves having to operate in. But if we're going to move to more an ecosystem type organisation, then we probably need to transform leadership as well. Because leaders in our organisations and the models of leadership that we've taken have really been designed to operate a machine-like organization. Most leaders aren't prepared to lead in ecosystem type organizations. And when leading in a machine organization, leaders tend to have a very narrow focus, and they focus on narrow goals to achieve the goal for their team or for their division, for their department, for their business unit. So they have narrow goals. And therefore, they're not practiced to work with the interconnection of issues. They're not practiced to work with the whole system. They're not practiced to work with complexity. And in fact, the PwC survey back in 2015, it was some research carried out, they do it every 10 years, argued that actually within society, only about 8% of leaders have the capability or the complexity of mind to work with the complexity in the VUCA environment that the organizations are facing, only 8%. And I see that in my work when I do executive profiling. Most of the leaders I work with are very able to work with linear problems, and they have linear thinking. So the linear thinking is A plus B sort of thinking. And they're very effective at doing that. A few I work with can work with systems, but very few leaders I work with can actually work with multiple systems at any one time, multiple systems in parallel. And I don't think I've really worked with anybody who can work with chaos, to sit back and let the natural patterns of emerge out of chaos. So most leaders really haven't got the capability to work with a high level of complexity. That's what PwC are arguing, and my experience backs that up. And you think, well, why not? And one of the things that I find is that what happens is when we face uncertainty and complexity, we have a fear of failure. And when that fear of failure kicks in, what we tend to rely on is our existing skills, our strengths, if you like, the most favorite tool in the toolkit. And we try to use that to get us out of trouble when we've got this fear of failure. And what that tends to be with leaders, they tend to rely back on their early training, which is around this linear type of thinking, this cause and effect type thinking, rather than working with complexity. So the fact of facing uncertainty and complexity makes us go back to simpler ways of thinking. And that's probably why we haven't got the complexity of mind to work with the complexity that we're facing in the operating environment. So what that means then is we have to work on our inner development, developing more agility in how we think, feel, and behave. So this is the connection between inner development and transforming leadership, transforming organizations, transforming society. So inner development to create outer change. Now, when I look at this diagram, I realize what I've created is a very linear diagram, of separate pieces. Yeah, so I fall into the same trap. But in reality, there's no separation between inner development and societal change. Our society conditions our psychology. It's very much integrated. It works both ways. Our organizations condition our psychology. So we can't really separate it out. We can't separate our consciousness out from the environment. It's very much integrated and they work together. This recognition that in changing society to become more sustainable, we've neglected the inner world. That has prompted the development of the inner development goals, which we've got here, okay, to tackle this problem, to put inner development on the agenda in terms of sustainability. I think this was launched, what was it, 2021? Some people got together and to thought about, well, what will it look like? What will inner development look like? And then went out and did a survey and got a lot of input, and that has created this framework. Now, this framework has received a lot of criticism recently, and the criticism really is around that it's an engineering solution. It's engineered. Inner development, our inner world, can't be split up into these 5 dimensions, and these 5 dimensions are all separate. And can we have goals? Can inner development be measured in terms of goals? Do we have goals in our inner development? And should we have goals? And also, perhaps, does it recognize that all of us have a different experience of inner development? And so we can't say this is what inner development should be. And so in many ways, it's almost an engineering approach to engineer our psychology. And then what happens if organizations start using this with their people to engineer the psychology of their people? And these are concerns that a lot of people had and levied criticism at the Inner Development Goals Initiative. And then to perhaps counter that, the team behind the Inner Development Goals are saying, oh, hang on, this is a simplified communication tool. We're communicating the need for inner development to corporations using this framework, and therefore it's a simplified communication tool. And they're saying if we're working with leaders in machine-like organizations, perhaps we have to use machine-like language and use these engineered solutions, use these simplified models. And I can relate to that because, to be honest, that's what I've tried to do all my career. Many, many times I've had HR managers and L&D managers tell me I have to simplify the message that I'm giving out to their leaders because they haven't got time to work with the complexity to try to understand it. And that's why in my profession in leadership development, we're full of models and 2x2 matrices to try and simplify everything. Yeah, that's what we're told to do. And I try to use the language of the people in the corporates to communicate my message across. It's no good me standing in my field shouting to somebody else in another field saying, come to me. I have to go to them, use their language and then bring them over to my field. So I've got a lot of understanding really for what the Inner Development Goals team are trying to do to communicate inner development out to the corporates and why they've used this engineering approach. And they've been very successful at doing that. They've been very successful. However, are we doing the right thing? Because if we keep using the language of the machine and keep using the language of engineering, are we reinforcing the problem we're trying to solve? Should we be using more language around complexity, interconnection, around ecosystems? And as I prepared this presentation, I remembered that one of the co-researchers in my research quoted a feminist scholar, Audre Lorde. And the quote from Audre Lorde is that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So if we keep using the tools of engineering and machine-like to try and change organizations to make them more ecosystem-like, we're not going to do it. Yeah, we're just reinforcing that machine-like language continually. So what's the solution? Well, it starts to work with more complexity, helping leaders to become more comfortable with complexity. And I believe all of us have the ability to work with complexity. It's within our capability, but it's just blocked out by other things. And one of the things that blocks it out is this fear of failure that stops us working with that complexity. And let's face it, probably mostly in our schooling years, we've been taught this linear way of thinking. It's very, very ingrained within us. So to understand what capabilities leaders need, to start my research, I was drawn to these stage models of adult developmental psychology. And there's lots of these models around, and it's the idea that throughout our adult lives, we go through periods of growth in our psychology and a plateau, a growth, and then a plateau, all throughout our lives. And the periods of growth are triggered by when we face a problem where our current worldview will not provide a solution. Yeah. Now we'll have a period of anxiety, but hopefully if we're supported through that, a new way of seeing the world will emerge, which helps us to solve the problem. And therefore we go up to another level in our development. And there's lots of these models around, but so what they do tend to have in common, because each model looks at 8 different aspects of our psychology, what they do tend to have in common are conventional stages and post-conventional stages. And the conventional being that most of us develop through the conventional stages, but few of us develop into the post-conventional. So that's the difference. And a lot of these models, these stage models of adult developmental psychology, have also been criticised a lot recently. And one of the criticisms is it's hierarchical, that the higher you are, the better you are. And that's not necessarily the case, because it's about having the complexity of mind to match the complexity of your work. You don't need to go higher, really. But also, as I believe, we've got the higher stages within us, they just need to be unfolded. Perhaps we just need to get out of our own way. So it's not that people are higher are better, it's just perhaps they've had more of an opportunity to release that aspect of themselves. But also as well, they're criticising for only perhaps mapping one path and assuming that we all go along this same path and we all have the same experiences. And people argue, using the metaphor of the mountain, there's not just one path up the mountain, there may be multiple paths up the mountain. And also there may be multiple mountains. So we can't assume everybody's going to go through the same stages and have the same experience. And I think some of these criticisms are really to confuse perhaps the map and the terrain. These stage models are maps, but they're not the terrain. And when we walk the terrain, we all have a different experience as we walk across the terrain. But also as well, the terrain changes as we walk across it and maps go out of date as well. And maps are simplified models. They don't capture everything. So I think whilst maps are useful and these stage models are useful as maps, we can't assume that they map the terrain exactly. We all have a different experience and it changes. So that's really some of the criticisms and the counters to the criticism. But the key thing for me, and the reason why I started with this is my research, is it identified the characteristics of these post-conventional leaders. And the research has found that leaders who are operating at these post-conventional stages are much more successful in implementing sustainability initiatives than those leaders who work at the conventional stages. And this is probably because they work with higher levels of agility. They have a more complex mind. They use more complex thinking, work with interconnectedness. They're more flexible in their behavior. So more agile in how they think, feel, and behave. And that agility allows them to be successful when working with complex problems in sustainability. And then there's a couple of other things that have come through in the research, which has interested me, is that these leaders tend to have a quieter ego. And now, in the research literature, there's lots of definitions of ego, but really what we're talking about here is our sense of self, who we are, our self-image, our self-identity. And then sometimes to maintain that self-identity, we need to defend it, we need to promote it. And so people with loud egos promote themselves quite a lot in terms of projecting their ego, and perhaps that needs more defenses, if you like. And these leaders, the post-conventional leaders, tend to have a quieter ego. And then anecdotally, leaders who are operating at the post-conventional stages have tended to practice or continue to practice methods that engender altered states of consciousness. So I'm thinking, well, what's the link here? Is there a link between practicing an altered states of consciousness and that quietens the ego, which allows you to be more agile, which allows you to work with the complexity of sustainability initiatives? And that's really the basis of my research, to try and explore the links between each of these. And I've mentioned altered states of consciousness, just to define this a little bit. And this assumes that we've got a stable state of consciousness, a normal state of consciousness. And I think that's a bit of an assumption, because I think our consciousness changes all the day, depending on what we're eating, how we're interacting, what we're doing, what we're listening to, etc., etc. But generally, it's viewed that we've got a stable state of consciousness, and an altered state is something different from that. And the altered state I'm more interested in is a peak experience, these higher states of consciousness that we all have. And you may have had a peak experience, I'm sure you have. You know, it could be going to the woods and connecting with nature, climbing a mountain and being overwhelmed by the beauty of the scene in front of you. It could be dancing in a club together with a group of people, meditating on your cushion, listening to the music of Bach, whatever it is. We all have these peak experiences, and those are the altered states of consciousness that I'm interested in, these moments of ecstasy and happiness, whatever it is. Okay, so I've been talking about consciousness, but what is consciousness? Okay, simple question, we've all got it, so you should be able to answer it. What is consciousness? Could you put your answers in the chat, please? What do you think consciousness is? quality of knowing. Thank you. Awareness, yeah, lots of awareness. Awareness and awareness of ourselves. Fundamental quality of the universe, great, yeah. Emergent quality of the brain, yeah. Lovely, thank you. Ability to make meaning and experience. Combination of body, learning, yeah, brilliant. Lovely, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Yeah. Now, I was a bit flippant, really, in saying, it's an easy question. We've all got consciousness. We should know what it is. Yeah. Because in science and philosophy, it's known as the hard question. Nobody knows what consciousness is and what produces it, but which I think is great, because that means we can all have our own theory. We can all have our own definition, and nobody can say you're wrong. They may argue with your logic, but then nobody will say that you're wrong. And I love that. It's a frontier, really, of science and philosophy. And then looking at the research literature, somebody has identified at least 40 different definitions of consciousness. So it shows really the exploration that we're all going through to try and define it. But Mansell has said here that most of the definitions include three aspects: our phenomenal consciousness, which is really our experience; our excess consciousness is really what we do with that experience, so our psychological functions, how we think, feel, and behave; and then our self-awareness, which is really our sense of self. Yeah, and we saw many of these come through in your definitions of consciousness as well in different ways. And for me, one of the difficulties I've had with working in this field is quite often the scholars, they use the terms conscious and consciousness interchangeably. And I think they're different. I think being conscious, have that conscious awareness, is part of our consciousness, but they are different. But these are some of the difficulties we have in this field. And then we talk about, well, where does it come from? And Charles Tart says here that it's a conservative worldview, that consciousness comes from the brain. Yeah. So the matter in our brain, the neurons, produces the consciousness. That's a conservative or the conventional view within society, within science. But Charles Tart has also said that there's a more radical worldview, that consciousness or awareness, at least partially, may exist outside of the brain. Okay. So we've got these two views, which I want to explore with you today. So first of all, materialism. This is the idea that our brains, the matter in our brains, produce consciousness. And that's probably the dominant view in societies we have today. But it came from Thomas Hobbes originally, the philosopher. And that was in response to Descartes, René Descartes' dualism. And Descartes said, mind and matter are completely separate. And Hobbes was saying, well, no, they're not completely separate. It's the matter in the brain that produces consciousness. So we've had this view for, probably a good 400 years or so. But there's a number of challenges to materialism. First of all, it's unproven. Yeah, there's no evidence, scientific evidence, that the brain produces consciousness. Okay, there's neural correlates, that we can see changes in brain cells that correlate with our experience, but that does not mean that actually it's the brain cells producing consciousness. The materialist view of consciousness cannot accept the evidence that's coming out from parapsychology. And there's good research, good rigorous research in parapsychology, extrasensory perception, etc. Good research that suggests there is something there, but materialist view cannot accept it. And then the materialist view of consciousness doesn't really work well with quantum physics, and quantum physics is a bit of a mystery. Perhaps that's a bit of an unfair criticism, because I think it was, what's his name, Feynman, said that if you think you understand quantum physics, you don't, because it's so complex, nobody understands it. The thing for me, which is the biggest problem with materialists, it encourages separation. So if consciousness was within our brains, in here, in our heads, that means we're separate from nature, we're separate from each other, and perhaps we're separate from our spiritual selves. And many commentators working in the field of sustainability say that these three separations are at the root cause of the sustainability problems that we're facing. And that's because perhaps if we're separate from nature, then we can exploit nature without feeling its pain. If we're separate from each other, we can compete with each other, and perhaps we compete with each other with conspicuous consumption. We buy stuff to impress people. Yeah. And if we're not connected with our spiritual self, then perhaps we lose purpose and meaning in our lives. And we covered that with addictions to consumerism. So I think this separation is a big problem in our society. But there is an alternative view. And this alternative view is that consciousness exists as a universal field, a fundamental within our universe, a fundamental force, if you like, or energy that we're all connected to. We're all connected to this universal consciousness. So I'd like really to play with this idea as a bit of a mind experiment, a thought experiment, to play with this idea. What if consciousness exists outside of our brain, universal consciousness? And it's called post-materialism, but I think it should be called pre and post-materialism because this idea has been around for at least 4,000 years, really, with the Vedic rishis. We've got a Greek philosopher there, Plotinus, as well, had that view. And then here are some other people, more contemporary, who have shared this view that consciousness exists as a field outside of our brains. And one there in particular, Max Planck, who's one of the founding fathers of quantum physics, and he said, you can't get behind consciousness. Yeah, consciousness is primary, and consciousness creates matter. And I think we see that in the interpretation of the double slit experiment in quantum physics, that I think it's the Weiger von Neumann interpretation, that it's our consciousness that collapses the wave of potentiality into particles, so consciousness creates matter. And a lot of this thinking that consciousness is primary has gone into the Galileo Commission report in 2019. And the Galileo Commission is a project set up by the Scientific and Medical Network. And it's really to encourage people to expand this view of science, to expand it, to open it up away from having the constraints of materialism, and to perhaps be open to the idea that consciousness may exist outside of the brain. Okay, so if consciousness exists outside of the brain, how does it become individual? And a model here that I quite like is the filter model of consciousness that a number of people support. And then perhaps within this universal consciousness, we may have our spiritual self, our spiritual mind, our soul, if you like, and that attracts consciousness down into our physical bodies, into our embodied brain. So the purpose of the brain may be to translate the spiritual mind into the mind that we experience day to day in this physical realm. So manifest the spiritual mind into the physical realm to create the mind that we've got now. And then that mind creates our psychological functions, how we think, feel, and behave, that we use to interact with our experience, our awareness of our experience. And it's called the filter model because, as you can see, the flow of consciousness gets reduced as it goes through each of these stages. And I think one of the biggest reducing valves, if you like, is our mind. And our mind does contain the contents of our mind, and so perhaps our beliefs and our values, and they may be aligned to sustainability, they may be not. But also then those values and beliefs attached to our ego. And as I mentioned earlier, our ego as our sense of identity, our sense of self, our self-awareness, our self-image, if you like. But also what attaches to the ego is perhaps our past traumas, our past hurts, our psychological scars. And then that requires the ego to defend itself, to keep itself safe. So we have all of our ego defenses. So all of that, I think, our ego defenses, our self-image, and perhaps our scars, reduces the flow of consciousness to our psychological capabilities, how we think, feel, and behave. So if we can quieten down the ego, perhaps more consciousness will flow through. And this is really something that was highlighted by Aldous Huxley. And what he said is that he called it the brain. He said the brain is like a reducing valve, allowing a measly trickle of consciousness to flow through just enough to keep us alive on this particular planet. Well, I don't think we're necessarily keeping ourselves alive on this planet any longer. Perhaps the time has come now that we open that reducing valve, give it a quarter turn, and let more consciousness flow through. So that's really what I'm looking at in my research, is how can we quieten the ego to let more consciousness flow through to our psychological functions so that we can work with a higher level of complexity. So what that does then is it puts consciousness at the heart of the inner development goals. So consciousness can flow through to our being, our thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting. It's the source of our inner development goals, if you like. And I've represented inner development goals in a different way here to try and perhaps present them in a way that is more in line with an ecosystem rather than a machine. So rather than an engineered solution, more of an ecosystem solution. So I've presented it here like a flower, if you like. So I call it the flowering of inner development. And this is where each of the dimensions in the development goals are actually connected to each other, that they interact with each other. They're all connected to consciousness at its heart. And like any flower as well, it has to be connected with its environment. You know, a flower needs the sunlight, it needs the air, it needs water from the rain, it needs the nutrients in the soil, it needs the insects. So I think it's the same with us and our psychology. We need to be very much connected in with the environment as well. Okay. What we do now, you've just gone past 8 o'clock. So what I'm going to do now is just, I've probably been talking for long enough. We'll take a little bit of a break for you to contribute anything or to ask any questions. So we'll take a bit of a 10-minute break. Is that okay, Javon?
Absolutely fine. Terry, what's your intention for the break? That we have a discussion? Or...
Yeah, but just have 10 minutes of a discussion, people contributing, asking questions, just for 10 minutes, just have a bit of a break so people not listening to me the whole time.
Great. Well, there's been some activity in the chat window. And an interesting comment from Ray is separation and the individual as a concept created our society as it is. Not that we need to turn attention back to you, Terry, right away, but I find this interesting. Ray, I don't know if you'd wish to elaborate on that, and perhaps how separation and the individual self are perhaps a factor in terms of what Terry's presenting here, and perhaps how interconnection and a more expanded view might point toward an opening, a potential solution to challenges of our time. Ray, do you have any follow-up on that?
Oh, solutions to the challenges of our time. No, I don't have solutions. I have plenty of questions. But what I would point out about that is that before Marx started to talk about, the death of God and what are we all going to do, we did live in a world, even in the times of the end of feudalism as capitalism was taking over, we did live in a world where man was much more connected with the environment, where the idea of service and responsibility were seen as integral to living. And believe it or believe it not, but in those times, people worked a lot less and appreciated a lot more. And in fact, so what I want to see is the culmination of us becoming separate and being successful individuals, which came from all of those changes into capitalism, is pretty much where we are. That's what we've created. It's a logical end, which I suppose was starting to be pointed out by the original Limits to Growth report in the early 70s. It's like it just picks up and it keeps going, and we're going exponentially now because we believe most people are exposed from a very early age to this idea, even at school. The idea of school is we're individually successful, intelligent. There's no social aspects in most schools. I'm not talking about Montessori or whatever, which is great, but in general, it's about the individual. And if that's what we want to create, this is the result we've created.
Yeah, thank you, Ray. Well said. I don't think I can add much to that, really, in that, yeah, you're right. Right from school, we've been taught to be individuals and to compete with each other as well. I certainly remember my age going to school, we were all sat in desks in rows, completely separate. I think it's changed now where they sit more on circular tables to allow collaboration. But then most of the exams are individual, rather than collaboration as such. Sports go quite often to foster competition. And that fosters the competition we have between each other, which then materializes as conspicuous consumption in adult life, that we buy things we don't need to perhaps impress people we don't like, and we buy that with money we haven't got. I think it was a financial advisor, I can't remember his name now, who said that. And that's our society, and that fuels consumerism, and that fuels capitalism. That's what it's about. Yeah, thank you, Ray. Fully agree with everything you say.
Wendy has her hand up. We'd love to hear from you, Wendy.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. It's good to see you. Thank you, Terry, for your very clear explanation here and interesting information that you've shared. I have a question about the referencing of the IDGs. Recently, I think it was on LinkedIn, Jessica, you had a clip about the Nordic Secret by Lene Rachel Anderson. And, if we think about our unique understandings of IDGs, and for that matter, all information that we process, that we create, our own unique understandings very much belong to us because of their uniqueness. But I feel that information such as the Inner Development Goals, for example, or the UNESCO Sustainable Development Goals, those like general or universal worldwide like understandings, they like a mountain or an ocean. I feel they belong to everyone, and we have the privilege to share in knowing about and adding and contributing to what we hear and what we see. So I would like to hear your opinion about this clip. I'm sure you have also seen that about the Nordic Secret and what Rachel or Lene Rachel Anderson said about her contribution and the book that she wrote. And then when I, for example, or any one of us, when we use the Inner Development Goals in a journal article, in a presentation, how do we reference and who do we use as our reference to acknowledge a person or an organization? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Wednesday. Yeah, we were aware of perhaps that social media storm that unfolded over Christmas as a result of her video and her statement, and I think most of it was arguing that one of the founders of the Inner Development Goals, Thomas Bjorkman, had taken her work from the Nordic Secret and integrated it into the Inner Development Goals. And she wasn't happy with the Inner Development Goals in terms of some of the criticisms I mentioned earlier around them being heavily engineered and having goals for individual development, things of that nature, and didn't want her name to be associated with it. And Thomas has responded to that. And I don't want to get into really the debate of whether it was her work in her book or and how much Thomas was involved, because obviously we don't know what the truth is there. To what degree was Thomas involved in writing the book? I think the original one he was down as the editor, and then the revision he was down as a co-author. So I think we'll leave it for them to argue really who owns the intellectual property within that book. Though I think sometimes in order, with the the magnitude of the problems we're facing, to be arguing over intellectual property is probably not taking us in the right direction, is my personal view. But then I think I've highlighted some of the valid criticisms that she raised about the engineering model, and then the inner development goals response to that. It's a simplified communication tool. But when I reference the inner development goals in my work, in my papers, I reference the website. Because I think what the website represents is a contribution of lots of people in creating this framework, and not just one person. I think that's one of the values of the inner development goals, is they've been co-created. I think initially the survey was about 1,000 people at least. Now there's criticisms that the first framework that we're working with now was very Western orientated, and I think for the second framework they're going out to a more global audience. So I think countering that criticism, but that's what I do, is I reference the website rather than the people behind it to recognise that co-creation.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you, Wendy.
That makes sense. Thank you.
There are numerous questions in the chat window now. Thanks, everybody. Javier's got a hand up, so let's give you priority for that reason, Javier.
Yeah, thank you, Jevan. Thank you, Terry, for sharing elements of your research. So I'm really looking forward and potentially then to share some models I'm working with and speaking about then the conventional and post-conventional way of thinking. For me, then the key difference between the conventional and post-conventional is the fact that people are making the personal Copernican revolution. So meaning they understand they are not the center of the world, but they are just part of the system. So it's for me the simplest definition I can give to then this transition from conventional to post-conventional. And there is a second dimension, because working as well with leaders, so often leaders make a number of declarations and they are in the mind potentially considering that they are part of a system, but in the body and in the heart, they are still part of, let's say, the conventional way of thinking. So it's really interesting as you speak about quadrants, Terry, at the beginning. That's useful to work with leaders. So we've got those quadrants. We've got conventional, post-conventional, and we've got then the mind and the body. And so in the body, we may speak about then the heart and potentially also extending outside or whatever. But it's really key to see where the people are. And I think that the true change are coming from the fact that there is an alignment between then the mind and the body, so to say, first point, and the person is in the post-conventional part of the quadrants, to really make sure that there is an alignment. Else, there is always then this disalignment, and as soon as ambiguity or complexity is just going too much, then the person tends, the leaders tends, people tends just to go back then to some kind of modern way of behaving, referring then to the model you shared before. And so the second observation on your linear diagram, and so to make this less linear, if we look to the society, in society we've got then the culture, in the culture we've got then the collective in consciousness, we've got the collective imagination that is polluting, or that is at least contaminating then all the previous bubble we have. And that's really a complex system with a number of feedback loop that are influencing so the way we move then through the chain. And finally, really asking ourselves, are we thinking, or are we just or are we thought? I don't know if that's the way to say this in English, but for me that's really key question. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Xavier. Yeah. I think David Bohm would say, are we just sharing thoughts, or are we thinking? Are we just repeating what we know and knowledge, or are we actually thinking? And what you just said there, I think, shows how complex it is the issues we're working with. And I think all of us here can work with that complexity, but then how do we communicate that out to leaders and managers? We end up with very simple linear diagrams, as I showed. Yeah, thank you, Xavier.
Are you able to take another question or two? Two hands are up.
Yeah, we'll take a couple more questions, and then I'll probably need to share a bit more of my presentation, and then we can have an experiential exercise. And if we've got time at the end, a few more questions, see what's in the chat. So yeah, happy to take a couple more quickly. Yeah.
Okay, Barbara, then Victoria, and then we'll move back to Terry.
Okay, thank you, Terry. It's kind of an abstract point, like, so I was getting a lot of emotion from from the way your expression of the presentation. I felt like there's a lot of frustration, maybe some anger, and so I was kind of wondering how you're feeling, and then how you would intend to deal, with taking that forward. To ultimately, I think we all want, to make an impact and, to make the world a better place, kind of. So just feeling a sense of deep emotion coming from you.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. Thank you for feeding that back to me. And I think you're right. And I think, yeah, I've got a lot of energy for making a difference. That's why I'm doing this work. That's why I'm doing a PhD. That's why I wrote the book. And I think the emotion that I feel mostly is frustration that we're not making progress. And then I get a little bit upset when, I'm starting to become an academic and involved, and I do like a bit of an academic debate and argument. But when that academic debate and argument starts getting in the way of what we're trying to do, then it separates people, and people fall into different camps, and we argue against each other, and it gets personal. And that upsets me, and I try to get beyond that. So I'm trying to make it practical. But yeah, so the emotion you're picking up is enthusiasm to make a difference, energy to make a difference, but then frustration that we're not progressing, and getting a bit upset that we're just arguing amongst ourselves rather than making a difference. Yeah, thank you, Barbara. Victoria?
Yeah, it kind of follows on actually, strangely, from Barbara's question. In a weird way. I'm curious, Terry, if you or actually anyone in the group has like a concrete example of the IDGs being used in an organization in this more sort of post-materialist, post-mechanistic way. Like I'm really curious to see if anyone's got a best practice, to use a lovely corporate phrase, example of where it has been used in that beautiful sort of flowering mandala ecosystem approach and generated something that can give us hope, that we can be proud of.
Yeah, good question. Thank you. Thank you, Victoria, for that. My personal experience in working with people that I've been involved with the inner development goals is that they're implementing the framework as it is, with the 5 dimensions. And they're implementing it with people who perhaps don't necessarily see the value of inner development for their own organization, and they're trying to make the case for that. But what we recognise at the Aleph Trust, and as part of my research, is that transpersonal psychology has a great deal to offer organisations as they're facing this VUCA world. And therefore, one of the reasons for this hub is to try and provide some thought leadership from a transpersonal perspective, from this post-materialist perspective, to try and work with the inner development goals and perhaps move them forward, if you like, to enable that. So we're at the leading edge, I think, and I don't know of any organisations that are implementing it in this post-materialist way, but I open it up to the group. Does anybody else know? Jessica?
Yeah, I can weave in one example, and it's funnily enough not in organisations, but involving young people here in the UK. I worked as a consultant with Rombert Dance Company, who rolled out a national program working in schools with young people, engaging them in creative activities. And they were interested in using the IDG framework as a way of engaging the young people around a kind of self-analysis for how they felt they had been opened up and revitalized and energized through the creative activities that this program was providing. So it was a really interesting project. We're just writing up the reports around that, actually. Why is it relevant? Because I think that sort of creative experimentation, liberating ourselves, giving ourselves permission to engage more holistically with education, leadership development, is a really healthy way of breaking down or getting around this sort of mechanistic metaphor that is surrounding the IDGs right now. So it's a lovely example, and it was in secondary education rather than in adult leadership development, but I think we can learn from that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jessica. And Jenny, did you have an example?
Wanted to share that I'm sort of using it that way too, Jessica. I work with doctoral students and I work in professional development of doctoral students, encouraging them to expand on their career possibilities beyond academia. And so I am looking at the IDGs as a skills development framework to sort of incorporate into work I'm doing, and it's all in the planning stages right now, but I would really like to incorporate the IDGs into some of the learning outcomes for the professional development program that I coordinate, and help students make connections to the greater SDGs and think about how their research can inform work on SDGs in industry, not only in an academic way, but in a sort of applied way. And I find that the IDGs are helpful for me to make that link between skills and the ultimate goals of sustainable development work. And so, yeah, I just wondering, I put in my chat box there about the criticism of that we're engineering people's psychology. Like, how is that different than any skills development program or leadership development program? So I don't really fully understand why that's a criticism, I guess, if you're approaching it as a skills development framework. So yeah, if anyone wants to speak to that.
I can speak to that, because there are essentially two types of development, and you can develop skills, but that in itself is not developing new consciousness. What you have to do is apply them together in containers or in systems where you begin to therefore establish the capacity for thinking in different ways. And that's none of the skills. It's actually using them all in practice in such a way that, how can I describe it? You can give somebody a box of tools. It's never going to make them a time-served professional. You have to actually watch those tools in action. You have to begin to understand how they interact, when to use them, when not to use them, what they actually come together as. So the tools themselves are just tools. You have to start creating containers that allow people to experience genuine state changes in their consciousness that they begin to then stitch together and grapple towards some level of psychological development. So the tools themselves are not enough alone.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, everybody. I'd love to continue this discussion. I think it's really rich. At the same time, I'd love to share with you some of the key findings that have come out from the research and have a little experiential activity with you. So if it's okay, I can do that quite quickly, and then we go to some more questions. Is that okay? Yeah, see some nods. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jivon. I'll just share my slides again. Here we go. Can you see them? Yeah, okay, great. So in my research, I've completed, or we've completed really, because it's a cooperative inquiry. We've completed one study and we're halfway through the second study. So I'll show you the results from the first study, first of all, the key findings, which looked at the relationship between consciousness development and leadership performance. And one group, we had two groups in each study, and one group defined consciousness as our ability to be aware of and to respond to the problems that are facing society. And they recognized to be more aware of the problems is about expanding awareness. And some people use that as a definition of consciousness, expanding this awareness. So developing consciousness is developing our awareness, expanding it, but also then to increase our ability to respond. So that is working with perhaps our psychological functions, how we think, feel, and behave to increase our ability to respond. But what comes through strongly as well is that what mediates both of those is our ego. And they recognise that our ego has been conditioned by society and conditioned by the organisations within which we work. Our ego has been programmed. So, for example, one co-researcher said that when we see problems in organisations that we're working within and perhaps how they're contributing to sustainability problems we're facing in society, to actually ask about those problems is too disruptive and we'd lose our jobs. So in the end, we stop seeing the problems in order to protect ourselves. So they talked about that our consciousness becomes fragmented and perhaps we become semi-conscious. So it's be like working in the tobacco industry and not asking, why do our products kill 6 million people a year prematurely? You can't really ask that question if you're working in the tobacco industry. It's too disruptive to do that. And so we become semi-conscious of it. So for them, developing consciousness was raising awareness, increasing our ability to respond, but also deconditioning our ego and perhaps healing our ego within there as well. And we talked about leadership. And they said that actually there's a range of leadership from the direct to the subtle. So the direct leadership is the visible, tangible actions that leaders take that can be seen, recognised and rewarded. And the leaders said they have to do some of that to meet their KPIs or to respond to investors or people who are donating money to the organisation if they work in the charitable sector. So they have to demonstrate that direct leadership. And because it's visible, you have to have a secure ego to do it, to stand out in front. And quite often they said as well, this is like emergency leadership. You have to take action, visible action. But then on the other end, there's this more subtle leadership. And this is, it's not seen by other people. So this could be a little conversation around a coffee point. It could be the energy you turn up with when you enter into a room. And it could be as simple as your thinking, the thoughts that you're having if they're going into that universal consciousness. And this requires a quiet ego because nobody sees what you're doing with this subtle leadership. But they said, the change makers I was working with, they said, this is where they make the biggest difference is in the subtle leadership. This is where the action is. Yeah. And it requires you to tune into or sense into the relational field to see what's emerging, to give space to what's emerging, to lead in this way. And one co-researcher said it's like riding a horse backwards. You don't really know where it's going, but you can feel it. You can feel the direction it's taking through your body, and you have to make subtle adjustments to keep yourself on the horse and keep it going in the direction perhaps you want it to go to, perhaps. So it's much more emergent way of leading. And then one co-researcher described this as like a cherry tree. And he said that in business terms, a cherry tree would be seen as being very inefficient because it produces millions of cherries over its lifetimes, but it only needs one to set seed to replace itself. So why does it produce millions? It should just focus on producing one good seed, one good cherry to replace itself. Then we talk about that in terms of leadership, that this one seed that creates the change is a direct leadership. Yeah. But then the other seeds that the cherry tree produces provide sustenance to others. And these are the other forms of leadership. So in the natural world, the other cherries provide sustenance to all the other animals, perhaps, the fauna within the natural environment. But in leadership, these other forms of leadership enable others to take leadership, for others to emerge with their leadership, for leadership to be distributed. And then some cherries, they just fall on the ground and they rot. But that fertilizes the ground. So subtle leadership, they described it as really fertilizing the field, fertilizing the ground that enables the organization to perform. And that's where they do their best work. And then they recognize they have 3 states of ego. They have that conditioned state where they have to be semi-conscious because they have to defend their ego to keep their jobs. So they become conditioned. And people gave examples of, like, when you're making redundancies, you have to do what the HR department or the lawyers tell you to do. You can't be authentic. You have to be conditioned to protect yourself. But then at other times they can be authentic. So the ego is anchored in their own authenticity and they can express themselves. But then interestingly, they said they do their best work when the ego is transcended, and they called this the flow state of consciousness. And they said they know when they've been in a flow state of consciousness because they can't remember what they've done. But people come to them and say, you did a great job there. I like the way you handled that question. I like what you said there. And they can't remember what they said. They were in a flow state of consciousness where they were really tuned into other people. They had transcended their ego. So those are the findings from the first study. And interestingly as well, I found in the literature that people who engage in practices that enable higher states of consciousness, these peak experiences, tend to have more flow experiences in the workplace. So there's a bit of a link there as well. And then for the second study that we're halfway through at the moment, we're looking at methods to engender altered states of consciousness that quieten down the ego. And what's coming out is people, leaders, change makers engage in a whole wide range of different methods: meditation, singing in groups or singing alone, chanting, yoga, connecting with nature, dancing in a group or dancing alone, music, playing music, listening to music, breath work, embodied movement, practical tinkering, doing stuff with your hands, just tinkering, and actually, in a sauna as well. So lots of practices that engender altered states of consciousness and can produce these peak experiences or a flow state of consciousness. And often these practices are combined in different ways to form a habit or a ritual that we may perform first thing in the morning. And as I say, these practices or rituals can produce a flow state. They can quieten the ego narrative people are reporting, open the heart so we connect with people, and slow things down. And it's interesting because we realise that in terms of altered states of consciousness, people who do these sorts of things may be perhaps a little bit different than the norm, but the norm is to take substances at work that create an altered state of consciousness. So we hype ourselves up with coffee in the morning, perhaps sugar in the afternoon with our cakes or whatever, and then alcohol at night to quieten us down and send us to sleep. And then we do the same the next day, hype ourselves up with coffee and sugar. And perhaps in some industries, maybe a bit of cocaine, who knows? But all of these things speed up work, and work is getting faster and faster and faster. And what the people in the research are saying is actually when we engage in these practices, we slow things down. And that slowing down can ripple out in our leadership and slow things down for everybody else and give space to everybody else to slow things down. So it's a matter of trying to bring it back into the workplace. But they found actually sometimes they're two different people. You're more this spiritually developed person because of your practices in the morning, your ritual. And then when you go to work, you put your ego cloak on, your defenses, and you go into battle in many ways. So how can you bring that state of consciousness from your ritual in the morning into the work? And we found it's using these micro practices but throughout the day, but we have to remember to do them. And people had certain techniques to remind them to do a little micro practice during the day, a little bit of yoga, a bit of meditation, a bit of whatever it is, to keep it flowing throughout the day so it can ripple out in their leadership. That's what I talked about there. And then one thing we started to work with recently is play, creativity, and laughter. And I've really focused on laughter recently because if we're talking about a peak experience, then laughter has got to be the ultimate peak experience. It really has to be, this joy, this happiness. And since 1995, I think his name was Madame Kataria, I think is his name, he's developed laughter yoga. And there's a whole wealth of research evidence around laughter yoga that it really improves us physically in terms of our immune system and lowers our blood pressure. Psychologically, it overcomes stress and anxiety and creates a positive mindset. And then what I'm interested in is it seems to develop more resilient ego. So is a more resilient ego a quieter ego? Quite possibly. And there's also some evidence that suggests it helps us to deprogram ourselves, to overcome our conditioning. And I think there's been a great tradition of using laughter or humour to perhaps challenge authority within a society. And we see that a lot on television. So I think laughter could be a real key practice. And the thing with laughter, which come out as well, is it doesn't have to be real. You can practice it as an exercise and still get the same benefits. Our mind and our body doesn't know the difference between real laughter and perhaps fake laughter. So laughter can then become an exercise that we can do to generate these benefits. So I thought what we could do for 5 minutes is just practice a little bit of laughter, yoga. Okay, you can go with me on this. Now, it is exercise. So with any exercise, if you've got a medical condition where you need to be careful when you exercise, be careful with this as well, okay? Because it is exercise. But also as well, they say don't do it if you've just had surgery. We don't want you popping your stitches, or if you're pregnant. So those are the warnings, okay? So we'll do it together. I'll stop sharing. Okay, so first of all, we've got to warm up. We've got to have a bit of a warm up. So we get a bit of a rhythm going, and that's clapping the hands. So we do this sort of rhythm, just like you're on the football terraces. So it goes 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, do it with me. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Now with that, we're going to start laughing. So we go, I'll demonstrate it first of all. Ho, ho, ha, ha, ha. Ho, ho, ha, ha, ha. Yeah, okay, here we go. Follow me. Ho, ho, ha, ha, ha. Ho, ho, ha, ha, ha. Ho, ho, ha, ha, ha. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And laughter yoga integrates with breathing. So we'll just do a bit of a breathing exercise. So I'll demonstrate it first of all. So we breathe in and raise your arms like this. Hold it, hold it, hold it. And then when we exhale, we'll laugh. Okay? Okay. So here we go. Breathe in. Hold it, hold it, hold it. Let it out with laughter. And again, breathe in. Hold it, hold it, hold it. Get it out. And once more. Breathe in. Hold it, hold it, hold it. Let it out. Okay, great. And what we can do now is, for those of you maybe a bit shy, laughing in public or laughing with your friends and family around you, we can practice a little quiet laughter. So this is the laughter we engage in perhaps in a library when we get a fit of the giggles. Yeah? So it's quiet laughter. Perhaps you can come off mute for this and we do a little bit of quiet laughter together. You can come off mute. Okay, so this is like a fit of the giggles that we're in the library. We're not supposed to laugh, so laugh quietly. Okay, lovely. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I do that one when I'm walking the dog in the morning, in case there's people around me in the woods. I don't want to see some crazy person laughing through the woods. I do a little giggle. Okay. So what we'll do now then, and we're doing this off unmuted as well. We'll do it together. We'll do it where we laugh gently and quietly, and then as I raise my hands up, we laugh louder or more raucously, and a good belly laugh at the top. And then I'll bring my hands down and we quieten it down and we quieten it down again. Okay, so if you do it all with me, okay, you ready? So we start off gradually and quietly. Oh, lovely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And one of the things with laughter yoga, as I'm sure you've worked out, we might start doing it as fake first of all, but we end up laughing at ourselves anyway and make ourselves laugh. And then when we do it in the group, it's just so contagious, you can't help but laugh, really. So we can get the same benefits. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is we just have a bit of silence and just go inside and just notice how it now feels after doing that little bit of laughter. Okay. Lovely. Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for going with me on that. Really appreciate it. Thank you. So what we've come to then really is actually laughter may be the secret to implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, because laughter may quieten down our ego, which may help us to be more agile in how we think, feel, and behave, which may help us to work with more complexity. And that will help us to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. So if you're looking to develop your leadership to create a more sustainable society, laughter could be the easiest way forward. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. That ends my presentation. We can open the floor now to more, or yeah, probably about five to 10 minutes of Q&A and contribution. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Terry. It's Scott here. Thanks so much for that really insightful presentation. Really, really great being a current student of the MSc and just bringing these ideas from into the corporate world, which I'm currently involved in, immersed in. Made a very interesting comment regarding I sort of put this in the chat, which sort of brought to my mind. Are you calling for like a wholesale reimagination of the way organizations are organized? I mean, as you know, organizations are set up generally by way of specialty in divisions, finance, risk, legal, marketing, and so forth. And there's good reason for that, you know, in terms of, you see that in legal, you see that in medicine, you know, specialty, there's a value in specialization in terms of the knowledge and the value that an expert brings to the table. And I guess what I've seen is where you've got successful leaders within organizations who've spent time maybe in other divisions and then made their way to the top, and then they've got different appreciation of different divisions, and they can take into account all the different factors in order to make the right decision, or with a team who can help them make the right decision. So with the idea of an ecosystem, are you calling for a reorganization or rethinking of these kind of traditional structures, or are you trying to, shall we say, reimagine the way of how the organizations deal with each other and are managed with the IDGs in mind?
Yeah, good question, Scott. And I think it would be foolish to say, you know, one sort of approach would fit all organizations. Every organization has to be designed to suit its own operating environment. But what I'm really challenging is that we do have this template or metaphor of a machine-like organization. And because it has so much control and so much separation and so much hierarchy, it's not able to respond effectively to complexity that we find ourselves in our environment. So the other model or metaphor was really the ecosystem, to show everything's connected, and things evolve naturally and is emergent. But how far the organisation moves to an ecosystem, I think, depends on the organisation and the industry that it's in. But for example, one good move could be that we still see a lot of leadership as being hierarchical. So many people say to me that a leader is a position, rather than leadership as something we all do. And it's to recognise that leadership is something we can all do, and therefore it can be distributed and emerging throughout the organisation, so different people come to the fore. And then we can use the great progress that we're making with diversity, equality and inclusion, that more people get to come forward. That could be a way. But also to recognise that a lot of processes we have in place are about control and stability. Sometimes we need to let go a little bit, but then you get problems with governance perhaps as well, which I think you're bringing out. So it's really a challenge to say, well, how far can we move towards an ecosystem? And there's a psychologist whose name escapes me as well, but he said all power is illegitimate until proven otherwise. So if we're using power in an organisation to keep control and lead, we've got to challenge that. Is it legitimate to use that power? Because I don't think there's so much power in an ecosystem. It's only in the machine, really, power. So, yeah, I wouldn't go as far as to say all organisations should move wholly into an ecosystem structure, but it's really a challenge of how far you can go towards that, so you can be more flexible, more responsive to the environment you find yourself in.
Maybe anarchy or anarchinism. Delegitimate.
Well, actually, yeah, that psychologist, his name's Noam, what's his name? Noam Chomsky. That's it, Noam Chomsky. And he is an anarchist, and he said that, yeah, all power is illegitimate to proven otherwise. But he's not saying that all power is illegitimate. It's just we have to know why we're using power. Is it necessary to have a power over others? Because when we do that, I think we're squashing people, really. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Terry. Cheers.
I'd like to sort of blend those two answers, or the question and the response from Terry, by saying an example would be most organizations have large HR departments. And I can't speak for Scott, but I imagine he probably thinks, yeah, that's the typical model and we need a department to look after people. But what's happened over 20 or 30 years is it's become the model, it's become one of the departments. And I've been to numerous meetings of HR professionals over the last 2 years where they're basically in crisis because none of the performance systems work. They cannot get people to actually grow and learn because organizations are affecting them in so many different ways that they just can't predict the capacity of people to take on anything anymore, never mind AI. But yet we would argue that yes, we need an HR department. And I think that's so there's the thing, as Terry says, in nature, I mean, I love gardening. If I keep planting the same plant in a spot and it doesn't actually grow, you know, it takes me 2 seasons at best, and I say, I've done everything I can for this. I've even allowed a winter to grow roots. It's not going to grow there. I'm going to put it somewhere else, and I'm going to see if it thrives somewhere else. It's the same with the HR department. If organizations aren't thriving with HR departments as they are, let them go. Let the organization actually decide what it needs in order to get people learning and being successful. That is what Terry's talking about. Not the efficiency of keeping the same HR department with the same leaders on the same salaries, maintaining their own static position.
Yeah, I think HR is a special case. You know, what value does an HR department bring? You know, I'm not going to comment upon that, but you know, I'm more thinking in terms of other more specialty functions like risk. You need an organization who can manage risk, someone who can manage risk, which is so important. And you mentioned VUCA. That's all about risk, and to some extent, risk is unquantifiable, unobservable, unmanageable to some extent. But you talk about operational risk, credit risk, market risk, liquidity risk. All this requires specialization, which then gives rise to issues which Terry has described. So, take your point, Ray, in terms of the value of an HR function. But I think that the risk, if I may say, is generalizing what value does an HR function bring vis-a-vis other specialty functions, which I think are maybe separate or different.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Scott. Yeah. Anyone else? Dee?
Terry, I can jump in. It's Zoe. I'm sorry, I'm not on camera.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm sitting in my bed in my PJs. I won't lie. So that's why I'm not on screen. Really, really insightful. I love the topic. You and I have connected off here, and you know that my passion is around HR transformation. For the benefit of everyone here, I've been a HR leader for many years and worked in massive brands. And I have a really radical view of how the IDGs and HR come together, because ultimately people resources will always sit under HR as it currently sits today. Now, in my view, HR is a mini CEO organization. They try to have finance, marketing, communication, strategy, design, and the list goes on. And unfortunately, I say this with much respect to the HR community and the profession I sit within, the egos are so enormous that they won't let go of what really they need to let go of to focus on what is really around people change. Change is the constant. It's the one thing that I can absolutely, all of us can guarantee is going to happen over and over and over. And organizations that want to win and pivot and move quickly have to be nimble. So what they need is simply a people organization that's stripped back, where they can just focus on what actually the IDGs offer and focus on the change that is required to get people through it. Because people it's a process. Change is a process, but people are anything but a process. They operate in them, but they need time and they need care to move through the process at the same speed, at the same velocity, in the same direction. So I know that I have a radical view, and I'm not always popular for it, but I do believe that there is some education that is required for human resources and for psychologists to sit within that function to be able to help them. They cannot do what they are that is on their plate today. They're in crisis. So that's my view, and I do believe that the IDGs is a route to help land great change, but HR people as the gatekeepers have to be open to it. And so therefore the education, and people like me and you, Terry, are the ambassadors, and I'm sure many people on this call as well, but I just don't know who you are trying to move that into momentum of change and education in a kind and educated, intelligent way. So I'll get off my soapbox now, but that's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe, for your contribution. Yeah. And yeah, we may have radical views, we may not be popular for it, but this is a safe place and space to express radical views, because I think we've got to do that so we can all start to move forward. We've got to take risks. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Thank you, Zoe. Yeah. And Dee, at the beginning of this Q&A, I thought I saw you put your hand up. I'm just opening some space if you wanted to ask a question or contribute.
Thank you, Terry. I'm so stupid. I didn't know how to make that little mechanical hand come up. So anyway, thank you. Yes, you mentioned chaos. I really enjoyed what you said, and I've learned a lot from it. I'm not in this field, as you know, but I'm very interested in consciousness. And I just wonder, you were saying that chaos is a very important place to allow yourself to be in, say, as a group. Can you describe something about what you've experienced of that within groups, or you've observed in the groups that you've been working with? Because, and how something creative and new can come from that, but how do you hold people as they go through a stage of chaos?
Yeah, thank you, Dee. Thank you. I think it's really important, and I do a lot of this work around when I'm facilitating groups, if you like, and some of the issues they're dealing with can feel quite chaotic for them. And there is a tendency, especially if the leader is in the group, to establish certainty, predictability, and establish control. But when leaders start to do that within the group, what they miss is the natural patterns that emerge from the chaos. They start to structure it too soon, and then the leader sees what's in their structure rather than what's emerging. So in terms of transforming leadership, and I think one of the key things there is to help leaders create the space and to be comfortable in that space and secure, to allow natural patterns to emerge out of the chaos, to sense into that emergence and see what emerges. And it's different for every group, really, in what emerges. So it's, in many ways, sometimes for a leader, the skill is to know when to not lead, when to sit back, when to allow something to emerge, but to sense into that and sense into the patterns that are emerging. But it's difficult to do because it creates uncertainty, and people don't like uncertainty. So they quickly jump in to try and establish control. But of course, in an ecosystem, you know, what we see growing in the ecosystem are the patterns that are emerging out of chaos. An ecosystem is chaotic, and certain things thrive and certain things don't. Certain things emerge. And I think that's important, really. So I can't give you a tangible example because I'll be talking about individual clients, but that's what I try to do, really, is create that space for things to emerge. But it is difficult when the leader of the team is in the group as well. Thank you. Thank you, Dee.
Thank you.
We're coming up for full time, folks. Javier, I can see your hand's just gone up. I want to honor that. And just one thing in the chat window from Tim to pick up here. Tim has written, I work in the public sector and people are at breaking point with increasing demand and no money. They are burnt out and there's seemingly no time to learn. Tim, I don't know if you have a follow-up on that or a question, something to pose to Terry, perhaps?
Yeah, thank you. It's just how do you, it's all very well getting organisational buy-in to these kind of things, but how do you kind of manage to get that to influence at an individual level? Because, you're talking about transforming individuals as well as the organisation, because an organisation is only made up of its constituent parts, right? So how would you get that kind of engagement with these goals at an individual level from people who are broke, burnt out and overworked and underpaid?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't know how to answer it in a genuine way without having the empathy for what people are going through. And in some ways, to bring this into an organization is just another thing on top of everything else that they're dealing with. And I don't think that is particularly helpful. I think the first step is we've got to be healthy, haven't we? So we've got to find ways in which people can be healthy at work, and that has got to be the first step. But yeah, I can understand the pressures that people are under in the public sector, because there just doesn't seem to be any money anywhere, but there's a big demand on services. And I do wonder, where has all the money gone? Who's got all the money as such? Because it's not being distributed. But yeah,
bank accounts, isn't it?
yeah.
It's
My advice is people have got to be healthy. You've got to focus on that first of all, otherwise you're not going to get anywhere. You're just going to burn people out. Yeah, thank you, Tim. Yeah.
And perhaps just a reminder, if this is helpful, Tim, at Aleph Trust, there is the Nurturing the Fields of Change program that do make resources such as those we've touched on this evening available in a way that is at one level free. So that's something to look into on the Aleph Trust website.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. I am doing the MSc through the Aleph Trust at the moment, which is a fascinating course. But obviously, I'm more slightly also interested in how I can now start to bring some of this into the workplace as well, because it's life-changing stuff, right?
Good for you.
Thank you.
Pay it forward. There we are. Well, we're reaching time, folks. Javier, you did have your hand up a moment ago. Is there still something on the tip of your tongue?
Yeah, maybe again, so sharing some, let's say, outcomes from my work and experience consulting in company and dealing with ambiguity and chaos. So Terry, at the beginning, you were speaking about VUCA. So each company is living a certain level of VUCA-ness. And if the company is not fit enough, so this means there is not the culture for dealing with, let's say, this level of VUCA-ness, then this is a kind of depth that creates some additional stress. So companies are just enabled to transform tension into opportunities, but they are just adding stress to stress. When they've got this level of fitness, this level of consciousness that is good enough then to keep at bay the VUCA-ness, they start then being able to transform tensions into opportunities. That's something I've been able then to measure in companies and through the model I've been working with. And so what I observe is when, let's say, the level of VUCA-ness is too high, it's really like company. So the guys and girls in company have to run for the half marathon, the full marathon, but they are trained for a 5K. So it doesn't work. If they try then to run, they just burn themselves. So the point there, and for me, the key question, and I don't have the answer, is of course, we can't work on the external VUCA-ness and we can't reduce it. So then the point is training people for being able then creating then the condition for them to race the distance they've got to race. And if some people in the company are just unable to run then the distance, what about then giving them bicycle and creating then the tool in order then to reduce really then the tension and enabling then the company really to transform then tensions into opportunities. And for me, that's really the big challenge. And number of people, they are just unable then to deal with the ambiguity created by the vocabulary, and they are just requiring for more rules, for clearer job description, for number of additional conditions in order to bridge then the ambiguity. And it's just not possible to bring additional rules, because then you make then the situation more complex. It's really like trying to solve a system with multiple equations by just adding some additional equation and just fixing the variables, and then the system doesn't have any answer anymore. So really the key point is reconciling, helping, and creating awareness about this very situation, and just to recognize the pain of people as well. Because if they recognize they've got the fitness for running 5K, but they are required to run 21, so it won't be just burning themselves.
Yeah, thank you, Javier. Yeah, and I think that metaphor of the of training to run a marathon or run different distances is a great metaphor for inner development and the need for it, rather than trying to create more stability with these extra procedures and job titles and structure and stuff like that. Yeah, it's in development. But then thinking what Tim was saying about the people in public sector being stressed, and we would say, well, actually, you could reduce your stress if you do some inner development. That's a difficult selling message, really, because you're putting another burden on people. And then I was thinking perhaps a way forward is laughter. But then when people are stressed, it's to say, we've got a solution for you, let's laugh. You know, it's almost akin to the mindfulness coming into the organisation, and then the organisation saying you're stressed because you haven't done your mindfulness. You know, you're stressed because you're not laughing. It's difficult. It is really difficult. Yeah. Thank you, Xavier. Okay, yeah, well, we've gone a bit over time. Yeah, so lovely. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for all your questions and contributions. I'd love to stay with you for another hour and having this discussion and debate, but I know we've got to go. For some of you, maybe getting quite late into the evening now. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. I've really enjoyed the session. So I'll hand over to Javon just to close it out.
Thank you so much for sharing your research findings and your experience with us today. It's been rich and stimulating on many levels. Just one announcement before you go, folks. Our next hub session of this kind will be on the 11th of February at 7:30 p.m. UK time. It will be with Sophie McLaren, exploring conscious leadership, the science of human flourishing. And Sophie will explore the science of human flourishing through the lenses of neuroscience, leadership studies, and related disciplines in the context of our working life. So on the closing note of today's session, we'll be picking it up and continuing the conversation next month. You can register for the session on the same page where you registered for this one, and I've just dropped the link into the chat window. So thank you again to Terry and to all of you for your presence and participation today. Go well until next time. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Terry.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Cheers.